is that a building needs to be at risk in some way. Does it need us? A house that's likely to make a perfectly good family home is probably not one for us. This is Mavis Bank, a true cause célèbre in the conservation world, and one that is proving extremely tricky to unlock. And here's another building suggested quite recently to us. This is Brynglas Hall in Powys in Wales. The enormous dumper digger truck was apparently deliberately reversed into the house to hold up the gable. The setting needs to be good. This will be someone's holiday destination one day, and we want you to enjoy not just the building, but its setting too. This is the Ibsley Watch Office, and here is the very fine view over the lakes, which you get from the first floor windows, which is where the runways used to be. And they generally need to be small. We have landmarks ranging from 2 that sleep just 1 person. This is the radio room on Lundy, one of the 2 that sleep 1. And we have 2 that sleep up to 16, the Villa Saraceno and this one, Gargunnock House. And here is a tiny favourite of mine. This is Beehive Cottage, which was a lime burner's cottage on the Inverary Castle estate up in Scotland. As you can see, it's a charming little Hagrid's hut of a building, or rather was. The Duke of Argyll's agent at the time wasn't at all keen on us making it a landmark. And sadly, this is what it looked like some years ago when I last visited en route to Saddle. So probably a building that's beyond repair now. To these 4 requirements, we've now added a 5th, which is it fundable? When Landmark started, we had the Manifold Trust, which was a great financial support to Landmark in its early decades. But now each and every project we take on has to be fundraised for as a new and separate appeal. And so we have to think long and hard about how realistically we are likely to raise the sums required. In particular, we like to say that a building needs a good story on which to hang a fundraising campaign. It's worth adding that as well as the above criteria, it's now increasingly important that a new landmark will wash its face in terms of its letting potential. In the past, we might have taken on a building that really needed rescuing, despite recognizing that it might not let all that well. Nowadays, we want to be pretty sure that it will let well and contribute to the overall financial well-being of the charity. So where do the 100 or so suggestions each year come from? It's quite a diverse range of sources, ranging from actual owners, members of the public who've come across a derelict building, local authority conservation officers, landmarkers like yourselves, other building preservation trusts, and national bodies, such as the Church of England, English Heritage, Historic England, and CADU. We also get owners of buildings that have already been restored, asking if we will let them on their behalf. The answer is almost always no. There are a few landmarks that are let under what we call a management agreement, whereby we do let the building on the owner's behalf and charge a commission for doing so. But these almost all date back to Sir John's days and were often buildings restored by personal friends of his. Here's one example, Wolverton Gatehouse, and another building well known to you all is Hull Cottage. We also get quite a number of suggestions from estate agents, often simply asking if we'd be interested in buying a given building that is for sale, regardless of whether it's at risk or not. With very few rare exceptions, we almost never purchase buildings that are for sale on the open market, not least because we don't have the money sitting in the bank to do this, and we prefer to put our efforts into raising the money required for restoration rather than for acquisition. Belmont in Lyme Regis is an example where we did purchase the house as a private sale direct from John Fowles's widow. We like to think that all landmarks are special in some way, otherwise we wouldn't have taken them on in the first place. And so anything that isn't architecturally or historically interesting enough can usually be swiftly dispatched. And then by contrast, there are those buildings that when you read the email and open the attached photograph or two, the pulse quickens and you realize that here is something of real interest. This is Pembridge Castle near Monmouth. It's grade 1, dates back to the 12th century, has its own chapel, a moat, and I think originally had 3 drawbridges at one time. So what's not to like? It was offered to us by the executors of the late owner, originally to the likes of the National Trust and English Heritage. but they all declined it. You'll hear much more about it in due course. And of course, we have to be realistic about how many buildings we can have on the books, as it were, at any one time. Restoring historic buildings seems to get ever more expensive, and the amounts needed for projects like Flewin Celyn and Carverley Old Hall are truly eye-watering. So inevitably, we have to say no sooner or later to the vast majority of what crosses our door, tempting though many of them may be. All suggestions that come to us are passed to me sooner or later for the initial triage and evaluation. Buildings that are for sale can usually be swiftly rejected, but not always. A very recent suggestion has been for West End Garage in Turnestone, Herefordshire, which has in fact been suggested by no less than 4 different people in as many weeks. As a building for sale, we would normally say no immediately, but this is probably the earliest surviving petrol station left in the UK. And once we've all gone electric, petrol stations won't exist any longer, presumably. Will our grandchildren even know what a petrol pump was? And would a private buyer go to the trouble of restoring and maintaining the old pumps? So just maybe this should be an exception to the rule, and we're actively discussing it. Buildings that are clearly too big can be declined, especially given our preference for conversion to just 1 unit of accommodation. This is the original Cromford Mill by Richard Arkwright, which we recently considered, but deemed just too big for us. And of course, we have our existing landmark up in North Street, just up the hill. And some buildings are just too small. Having worked for Landmark for over 25 years, I have a pretty good nose for what is likely to make a good landmark. And as you well know, over the years, we've restored cottages and castles, forts and follies, and some truly unusual buildings, such as a pigsty and a pineapple. In recent years, we've decided to be a bit more proactive about taking on buildings of perhaps a more challenging nature, harder to reach buildings, if you like, that might less obviously make good landmarks, but are building categories that have candidates particularly in need. So the first category is small and significant industrial buildings. This is the Sudbury Gas Works, which we looked at many years ago, designed, as you can see, in a picturesque style by no less an architect than George Devey. We didn't go ahead with it, but I see it is soon to be restored, and I think is due to open in 2023. The second category is 20th century military buildings. This partially underground bunker is the rather wonderfully named Pirate's Nest, or in German, Parettenschloss on Alderney. Some of you might just recognize Marilyn Donahue heading in. In the end, we turned this down, partly because it was a Nazi construction built using slave labor as a gun emplacement to take out any Allied tanks trying to land on the beach. The third category is seaside and leisure buildings. This is proving to be quite a challenging category to find good candidates. Piers are, of course, far too big, and charming bandstands like this are just simply not convertible. The next category is small vernacular buildings, especially types where Landmark is underrepresented. So this might be something like a Hebridean black house, or as in this case here, this is a Lincolnshire mud and stud cottage, a simple but rare form of vernacular construction. They were described as costing as little as £33 to build in 1799. The next category is urban regeneration and historic town centres. This building is 34 Marketplace in Newark, spotted by Vanessa Shaw, our head of marketing. It's a grade 2-star building and described by Pevsner as one of the preeminent examples of late 15th century timber framing in England. And the final category in our new collection, our new set of criteria, is transport and communications. And we're doing quite well with this category. This is the Fool's Grave signal box, which we thought was well on its way to becoming a landmark. It sits just outside Scarborough on one of the longest platforms in the country. Sadly, the machinations of Network Rail ended our hopes. So this one at present doesn't look like it is going to become a landmark. And moving on to the final classic landmark category, this is the South Pavilion of Wentworth Woodhouse, one of the very grandest of British country houses. It has the longest facade of any private house in the country, and this small section at the far end will become a landmark in the not too distant future. We've also agreed that we will place particular emphasis on identifying projects in the North, Central and East Midlands, where we're currently less represented than other parts of England. We have no landmarks, for instance, in Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester and Newcastle, and many other fine northern cities. This is partly because quite a lot of at-risk buildings in these regions are often very big, mills and warehouses, for example. And if they're in town centres, the building, or at least the site, is often perceived as having a development value, and so nobody wants to give them to us. And contamination can also be an issue with industrial buildings. Sometimes we're quite keen on a building at first glance, but on reflection and discussion, we conclude that it doesn't really need us. This is the last surviving of what was once 4 piermasters' houses, controlling ships entering and leaving Albert Dock in Liverpool, a city where in principle we would be delighted to have a landmark. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but that's the pier, if you can, that's the piermaster's house up in the top corner of Albert Dock. It would no doubt let extremely well, but we somewhat reluctantly concluded that as it's owned by a large museum body and has been well restored, it just didn't meet the at-risk criteria that we look for. So the search continues for something more needy in Liverpool. So how are we doing against these different categories? You may be aware that the striking slate mining landscapes of North Wales have recently been made a UNESCO World Heritage Site. These are the Anglesey Barracks, as they're known, at Dinorwic Quarry in North Wales near Llanberis. And I can't help thinking, wouldn't one of these make a wonderful landmark in what is a stunning industrial landscape? We've seen the Ibsley Watchtower already, and here's its back view in the category of military, 20th century military buildings. This building has a tremendously exciting story directly linked to World War II and the defence of Britain in our darkest hour. In the seaside category, this delightful little building was looking promising. This is the William IV gateway to the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, this extraordinary confection down in that seaside town. So far, progress has stalled somewhat, but keep your fingers crossed that we might yet get there. And here's a building that's moving ahead nicely, the Station Master's House in Manchester. The building just to the right of it is the oldest passenger railway station in the world. Here we're working in conjunction with the Science and Industry Museum, who are doing great things in regenerating this part of the city. And lastly, in the transport and communications category, here is the clock tower at Wemyss Bay Railway Station. And Wemyss Bay really is one of the very best, and it features on the front cover of Simon Jenkins' book, The 100 Best Railway Stations. When a suggestion comes in that looks promising, the first thing to do is find out a bit more about it. Most, but by no means all suggestions are for listed buildings. And so one of the first things to do will be to check the list description, which in some cases will also have photographs attached. Historic England, Cadw and Historic Scotland all have sites for their listed buildings. Sometimes the search function can be a bit maddening. This is Historic England's Search the List site, which has very specific names, and any deviation will either fail to produce a match or alternatively produce far too many to sift through. I can't help feeling they could benefit from a bit of Google's algorithm technology. I'm sure there are other search engines available. Google Maps and the little yellow man, which I think may just be off your screen, but he is down in the bottom right-hand corner of the slide. The little yellow man that you can drag and drop, and so allows you to drive along roads. And this combination has proved a godsend for being able to have a closer look at buildings, their settings and neighbours. It really is incredibly useful to be able to drive around the area without having to go there. It doesn't work, however, though, for the more remote buildings where Google's camera car hasn't been able to get near. To find out more on the history of a building and often get to see early images, there are excellent resources, such as this is Cough Lane, which is for Welsh buildings, and the Scottish equivalent is this site, Canmore. If you want to be proactive about finding buildings that need restoring, where does one look to find historic buildings that are at risk? The following is a selection of sources and websites that are some of the best for finding buildings in need of restoration. Historic England also maintains a separate Heritage at Risk register. This covers Grade 1 and 2-star buildings, Grade 2 places of worship across England, and Grade 2 buildings in London. It also covers scheduled ancient monuments, wrecks, gardens, and battlefields. The conditions of buildings is rated from good to very bad, and priority for action is assessed on the scale of A to F, where A is the highest priority for a site which is deteriorating rapidly with no solution to secure its future, and F is the lowest priority. All other things being equal, the higher the listing and the more at risk it is, the greater the likelihood of a building being a candidate for us to take on. I've mentioned Save Britain's Heritage already, and they too have their own building at risk register. It focuses on Grade 2 and unlisted buildings, and so this complements Historic England's register quite well. As well as their database of at-risk buildings, which has more than 1,300 entries, accessible in detail only to members of Save, for which you can join for a modest annual fee, they also produce an annual catalogue of buildings seeking saviours, often with catchy titles such as Dare to Care, All We Need Is Love, Cherish or Perish, Opportunity Knocks, and Take a Chance on Me. The 2022 update has just been published, and this contains details and photographs of another 60 or so buildings actively needing rescue. Historic Environment Scotland has a site called buildingsatrisk.org.uk. This site used to be run by the Scottish Civic Trust, but it's now been taken over by Historic Environment Scotland. And it contains over 2,200 entries for buildings at risk. More happily, it says that over 200 have been saved, but less cheerfully, it says that over 628 have been demolished. And so the loss of historic buildings continues. Each entry normally has a good selection of photographs, as well as a useful timeline summary of recent developments. Some local authorities maintain their own at-risk registers. This is an example from the Brecon Beacons National Park Authority, who are the planning authority for that region. Sometimes these are available to the public, but not always. And writing to your local conservation officer can be a way to flush out something which may not otherwise have had publicity. And the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings has its own list. This is a list of buildings that are usually for sale, often through estate agents. And in line with SPAB's philosophy, they're looking for new owners to sympathetically repair and upgrade them. The list again is available only to members. As well as making use of Google Earth and Google Maps, there are quite a number of urban exploration type sites, which often have a large selection of photographs and sometimes videos too. There's meant to be a sort of code of conduct for more conscientious urban explorers, in that nothing should be touched or moved, and only photos or videos taken. Drone footage of ruined buildings is another useful source to help get a feel of any given building. The Urban Explorer is a good site, and another example is called 28 Days Later. When posting a report, this site insists on some history being included, and the standard of photographs is often very high. As the site says, many members are photography geeks, and there are other similar sites such as abandonedspaces.com and derelictplaces.co.uk. And there are some sites which are fantastic resources for photographs of derelict buildings. One of the best, and a favourite of mine, is this one, welshruins.co.uk, which is a mine of professionally taken, mostly black and white images from all over Wales. Another example is www.lostheritage.org.uk, a tribute to some 2,000 lost country houses. Other things which are useful to know about a building is, of course, who owns it. Often this will be obvious from the initial contact, but sometimes we get suggestions from a member of the public who has no knowledge of who owns a given building. If all else fails, a polite letter to dear owners and sometimes elicit a positive response. And here's an example of where that worked. This is a building called Caton Manor Gatehouse, really quite a recent discovery. It's almost a sort of unknown building that's only very recently been listed. And simple and sad though it may seem on the outside, inside it has this wonderful first floor room with a fully intact decorative plaster frieze around the room, including an elaborate coat of arms and the date and the initials of the man it was built for over the fireplace. So a little bit like the banqueting houses at Chipping Campden might once have been. It's also useful to know on what basis a building might be on offer. E.g., is it being offered as a freehold gift or on a long lease? As discussed, we can no longer afford to purchase buildings, as Sir John often did in the past. And so the most usual forms of tenure these days are either a gift or a long lease, typically 99 years at a peppercorn rent. So having found out a bit more about the building, my job is then to present the selected shortlist to my colleagues at the potentials meetings, which are held 6 times a year, every other month. Those that don't make the shortlist are rather ignominiously called direct rejects, but they still get logged for the record. It is perhaps worth adding here that overseas suggestions are a low priority for us these days. Despite currently having 7 landmarks in Italy, such as the wonderful Villa de Vescovi shown here, as well as Hougomont in Belgium, we aren't actively seeking to increase the number of landmarks abroad, preferring to concentrate our time and energy on UK buildings. I've had a quick look at the archive and I see that we've had suggestions in the past from such places such as Nepal, Jamaica, Portugal, India, and Malta, as well as the more usual France and Italy. Some of you may have heard of or even stayed in a Vivat Trust property. Sadly, they recently went into administration and we had hoped that the number of their buildings might have become landmarks. In the event, only one has come to us, which is the Birdhouse here in Shropshire, perched at a height in the tree canopy. So to get back to the process, at the potentials meeting, I aim to provide a PowerPoint slideshow with a decent selection of photographs of each building, as well as a brief summary of its importance, such as its date and listing, a brief history where known, and what the deal might be. Typically, there might be between 6 and 10 buildings for discussion each time, and we also do a follow-up on previous suggestions from earlier meetings. Attending these meetings are Anna Kay and all the other heads of department, Caroline Stanford, our historian, John Evitts, our furnishing manager, and myself. We regularly have quite interesting discussions about the merits of any given building. And I often say it isn't important that everyone is agreed it could make a good landmark, but it certainly helps as if at least one person feels strongly that it could. Assuming that a consensus is reached, we either reject a building at that meeting, requiring perhaps a tactfully worded email or letter from me to let the owner down gently, or we agree that it should be visited. Sometimes if a building looks a bit borderline, we might do no more than a quick drive past if someone is in the area. A quick look can often tell you if a building is worth pursuing or not. Here is one of my favourite images of Sir John having a sneaky look over someone's garden wall, with a rather perilous looking lean to it. Because of the number of suggestions we get, the rule is normally not to visit any given building until it has been discussed at the next potentials meeting. Those that are rejected at this stage are archived in a little more detail than the direct rejects, not least because it isn't unusual for a building to be suggested on another occasion, sometimes several times. A recent example is the Coates Roundhouse, shown here on a derelict stretch of the Thames and Severn Canal near Cirencester. Like our own Lengthman's Cottage, these were built to house a Lengthman and his family, despite the small size, to look after a stretch of the canal. This particular canal had issues from the start of an inadequate supply of water to keep the canal properly full, and despite long-standing plans to renovate it, the canal remains derelict. This is one of 5 such circular cottages, but all the others have been restored, leaving just this one. Lack of services is often a reason for a building becoming and indeed remaining derelict, and the Coates Roundhouse is quite remote. Given landmarks penchant for remote buildings, this is of course something we have faced many times. but the costs seem to rise inexorably. And unlike a tariff for the actual supply of electricity, you have no choice but to go to the local distributor for the actual infrastructure. And so there's no shopping around that's possible. When we restored Keeper's Cottage and subsequently Queen Anne's Summer House, they needed an electricity supply, and the cost was £40,000 back then. That was many, many years ago now, and I hate to think what it would be now. Luckily, most landmarks need only electricity and water. Just occasionally, a building can be just too remote, even for us. This is Belmont House, not to be confused with the Belmont in Lyme Regis, on Unst, which is the most northerly of the Shetlands. And on this occasion, this proved a journey too far, although it has now been restored and is currently for sale. You get 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms and reception rooms, not unlike a landmark's, plus 2 acres of land. And this is all yours for £395,000. And this is Glasshout Shield on the Balmoral estate, which didn't go ahead for a number of reasons, but one of them was that it does get cut off by snow in the winter and was just thought to be too remote. And sometimes a building that was originally rejected for whatever reason, and possibly more than once, does eventually end up becoming a landmark. Examples are Fairburn Tower, which is very current in our thoughts because it's coming along very nicely. As you can see here, the scaffolding is in the process of coming down. But Dolbellideer, Cobham Dairy, Semaphore Tower, Winsford Cottage Hospital and Clavel Tower are all examples of buildings which were considered on more than one occasion before they actually became a landmark. We aim to have at least 2 members of the Potentials Committee visit any new suggestion. We would normally visit with the owner and or their agent, which gives us a good opportunity to sell someone who may not be that familiar with Landmark more about us and how we operate. Following that visit, an initial assessment form is completed, which over a couple of sides of A4 aims to capture in summary form many of the salient facts about the building to share with colleagues, together with a good selection of photographs. The form has headings such as risk and need for Landmark to take on, condition and scale / cost of conversion, and ease, lack of complication, time and trouble. And one of the last headings on this form is gut feeling as a landmark, which serves to emphasize that judgments on a building's suitability as a landmark are often as much subjective as they are objective. All the various headings on the initial assessment form are capable of being scored from 1 to 10. So in theory, at least, you can derive an overall score for each building inspected. The potential building will then be discussed at the next meeting. And if colleagues like what they see and read, then we put the building to the next trustees meeting, inviting 2 or more of them to visit. This building is the Landgate in Rye, the last of the medieval gateways that protected the town, and the trustees will be visiting this later this year. They in turn report back to their fellow trustees at their next meeting. And if they share our view that Building X has the potential to make a good landmark, they will then give it what we call Gateway 1 approval. This is accompanied by a relatively modest budget at this still quite early stage to enable us to carry out a project evaluation, generally using an external architect and to a standard brief. And if we need things like a measured survey and structural or ecological advice, then we will include for this. There will usually be an initial cost estimate following the evaluation so that we have at least a ballpark figure for the likely cost. I should also add that at Gateway 1 stage, the building passes over to Susan McDonough and the Historic Estate Department to take on what is now deemed to be a live project. What happens after that is the subject of a different talk. So why wouldn't a promising potential go ahead? It might be that the actual site visit by staff, following the actual site visit by staff, that something becomes apparent that makes a building unsuitable as a landmark. It might, for example, be rather more derelict than the initial images suggested. Here's a recent suggestion called Rifulan in Powys, which even by landmark standards is really very derelict. Amazingly, Caddy tell me that this was occupied up until 2012, which just shows how quickly buildings can deteriorate. And in its deterioration, it's been discovered to be even more important than it was thought to be already. And it is, in fact, a cruck-framed open hall house. The trustees on their visit may not share our enthusiasm, but this very rarely happens. It might be that the project evaluation throws up significant issues that might make it prudent not to proceed. And the initial cost estimate might come in very much higher than we might have anticipated. And I can assure you that the final bill for a finished landmark is never less than these early estimates. And further down the line, we might genuinely struggle to raise the funding needed. Landmark has a pretty good track record with the National Lottery Heritage Fund, and long may that continue, but they have declined to give us a grant on at least 3 occasions that I can think of. Holwell Temple in Devon was one. This building, Highclere Temple, in the grounds of what's probably better known to most people nowadays as Downton Abbey, is another. And Belmont, the Lyme Regis Belmont, shown here beautifully stored, are all buildings that the Lottery Fund declined to give us a grant. Sometimes there's a reluctant, unwilling, or very occasionally, a downright hostile owner who simply doesn't wish to play ball. We've been quite taken on a number of occasions with the idea of making this building, the Bernard Klein Studio, into a landmark, but so far we failed to agree a way forward with the owner. It was designed by Peter Womersley in 1972 as a textile design studio, and it's grade A listed, and I hope you agree it has a certain feel of a James Bond villain's lair to it. Some buildings are just too small to make a good landmark without an addition. There are a number of landmarks where we've had to add an extension to make them work. Inglestree Pavilion, by the time we came across it, was just this front facade. And we had to add an extension to the back. Here it is, designed by Philip Webb. Lynch Lodge is another example, and Glenmalloch Lodge, looking like this when we took it on, had nothing more than a pair of cludges outside privies for the schoolgirls and teachers who studied there. It now has this beautifully designed rear extension which matches seamlessly with the rest of the building. This building is the charming Duff House Fishing Temple, which is an absolute little classical gem, sitting pretty much in a river, but unfortunately this one did prove too small. It was designed by William Adam of the distinguished Adam family in 1743, and it sits on an island in the River Deveron. Somewhat ominously, the Canmore site says that it was situated on this island, but I believe it's still there. The Buildings at Risk Register notes Landmark's interest as far back as the 1970s, and it looks as if it may end up being a bird hide, which is perhaps not too bad a use for it. Another consideration is both the type of building and where it is. Whilst each and every suggestion is considered on its merits, you will appreciate that with, say, Fairburn Tower underway, as is indeed the case as we've seen, we might be reluctant to take on another Scottish tower house in the near future. For example, this is Brakey Castle in Angus, so not too far away from Fairburn. There are 2 features I particularly like about this tower house. One is that behind that wooden door on the ground floor, it still has its original metal grille called a yett, a second line of defence. And I don't know whether you can see, but underneath every single window, there is a little gun loop designed so that you could shoot down onto invaders. This talk has given me the opportunity to share with you at least some of the ones that got away, buildings that on the face of it leapt out, at least to me, as being excellent landmark candidates, but for all sorts of reasons have sadly fallen by the wayside. So we'll come to a few personal favourites of mine in a minute. Some have been restored by other bodies or individuals. Some may still be waiting for their knight in shining armour to rescue them, and others may no longer exist and have been lost forever. Before I get to my shortlist, I should perhaps remind you of a couple of buildings whose loss incensed Sir John into founding the Landmark Trust. The first is quite well known. This is the Hurlstone Junction House by Thomas Telford on the Ellesmere Canal. It features in the book Landmark, A History of Britain in 50 Buildings by Anna and Caroline, and I'm sure as friends you've all read it. The other is much less well known. It was a modest but utterly delightful 17th century building called the Welby Almshouses at Denton. They were willfully demolished and without consent, despite Sir John's offer to take them on. Just look at that delightful stonework running around the gables with the fluidity of a ribbon. So here's a short list of some favourites of mine. This is Fat Lips Castle on the Minto Crags in Roxburghshire, and you have to love it just for the name alone. And the name Fat Lips, there are various stories, as you can imagine, but one of them is that the family who built it in the 16th century perhaps were a little over enthusiastic in their greeting of female visitors to the castle. The exterior has now been restored, as I think you can see from this photograph, but otherwise I think it's still a shell inside. This is Marmion Tower at West Tanfield in North Yorkshire, not very far from the ruin, a 15th century gatehouse in the care of English heritage, so perfectly well looked after, but a slightly sort of sad, empty shell inside with no roof. It's hard to feel it wouldn't be much better as a landmark. This is St Doulas Church in the Golden Valley, so over the hill from Flewin-Celyn. Its graveyard has over 200 species of wildflowers in it. It's been declared redundant and has been empty for a number of years and also has structural problems. But it also has a scheme for pod-type accommodation inside, designed by a firm of architects. So it is there and available for holiday use. This is an old favourite of mine, the Pigeon House at Kilwendig in South Wales. Tricky perhaps to convert, but it absolutely is a palace for pigeons, and it still desperately needs rescuing in a new use. This building, which is actually triangular shaped, is the Cambridge Gun Tower at Pembroke Dock, built in 1851. This is a building where we're still having ongoing discussions with the local authority and Cadw about whether this could become a future landmark. This building is the Monee Middle Lodge, which was a real favourite of Peter Pearce's when he was director of a landmark trust. I don't know who owns it now, but I think back then it was owned by a rather redoubtable Scotch lady who saw off anyone who tried to suggest it should be converted. And I think even Historic Scotland, as it was back then, were rather frightened of her. I think it's still crying out for conversion. This enormously grand building is a mausoleum to Seaton Delaval Hall. It's in the grounds of the hall, which was by Sir John Vanbrugh, but the mausoleum was built in 1766, so long after Sir John Vanbrugh's death. Martin Stancliffe, who worked on many a landmark before he became a trustee, produced a very elegant scheme for this building's conversion. Some of you may recognise this building. This is Warder's Tower in Staffordshire. You may remember it because we thought this was going to become a landmark. It was built as a picturesque gamekeeper's cottage, masquerading as a miniature castle. Sadly, in the end, the bats defeated all common sense. And as far as I know, the bats are still living in it, and it's not a landmark. And here is the very grand Eastern Neston by Nicholas Hawksmoor. It wasn't this house that we were interested in, but it has a most delightful pair of lodges, of which this is one half. Again, sadly, as so often is the case with lodges, on a rather busy road and a slightly sort of grim setting opposite. This building is High Cross House in Dartington, which was built for the new headmaster, William Curry, by the architect William Lescave in a striking 1932 international style. This is a long-standing case. Ex-Whistle Hall, which is now in a considerably sadder state than it is in this photograph, has been empty for decades, and I think there's still no solution in sight for it. And finally, just out of my list of a few favourites, this is Cowdray Castle Gatehouse on the left-hand side there, the tall towers. There was quite detailed discussions about that becoming a landmark, but in the end we decided as a site that has large numbers of public visitors, it wouldn't be suitable. So if you were to ask me the one building I would most like landmark to do, it would have to be this one. It's called Foxhall Neworth, just outside Henflan in Denbighshire in North Wales. The house was built by John Peyton of Denby in 1592 to outdo his rival and neighbour who lived in Old Foxhall. Foxhall Neworth was to be a magnificent H-shaped Elizabethan mansion, 5 stories high, quite unlike the much more vernacular Welsh manor houses of the time. As a recorder of Denbigh, and more significantly, Chief Secretary to the Lord Keeper, Panton occupied a position of considerable power and influence. And as the list description says, and I quote, based at York House in the Strand, he was well placed to tap the rich source of prerequisites and bribes available to senior court officials. In building Foxhall Newydd outside his native Denbigh, Panton was making a calculated statement to his peers about his newfound wealth and success. But unfortunately, ambition outstripped the supply of money, and the house was never finished, with only a third of EH being built. It does appear to have been lived in for a while, but seems to have been abandoned in the 18th century, and today it stands, to my eye at least, as a striking and imposing ruin just waiting to be rescued. Even in its derelict state, Cadw describe it as, and I quote, one of the most ambitious and sophisticated projects of Elizabethan house building in Wales. Rather interestingly, Dolbellidir, another favourite of mine, is just down the road. And although of slightly earlier date, it was exactly the same time in 1593 that Henry Salisbury published his Grammatica Britannica, written at Dolbellidir. He must surely have known John Panton and Foxhall Newydd, and I can't help wondering what he would have made of a nouveau riche extravagance being erected nearby. Foxhall Newydd is both Grade 1 and a Scheduled Ancient Monument, but it has no roof, nor even any floors. It's only the external walls that remain. And just about every timber lintel above the doors and windows has rotted away, leaving unsupported masonry hanging in the air. How it has survived as well as it has is a mystery, but time cannot be on its side. It would, of course, be a huge undertaking, and one to be tackled, I believe, along Astley Castle lines, i.e. creating a contemporary interior within its ancient walls. My scheme, if I can call it that, is to leave the basement for plant and storage, have bedrooms on the first floor, living accommodation on the second floor, perhaps with a balcony giving views out through the giant break at one end, and then a huge roof garden at what would have been the third floor level, looking out through and sheltered by the windows and walls at this level. And originally, there would have been yet another floor of attic rooms above this. So far, I haven't managed to persuade my landmark colleagues to tackle Foxhall Newydd. But if I win the Euro Millions lottery rollover, you know what I'll be spending my winnings on. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alastair. That was a completely fascinating talk. And we've still got time for a few questions. So without further ado, do you have a favourite landmark that you're yet to stay in?
Oh, well, I went to see Cowside many years ago, long before it got converted to a landmark. I visited with the architect who I think went on to do the project evaluation that I was describing earlier. And I'm actually off to Cowside in about 2 weeks' time. So I'm very excited to be seeing that after all these years, having never been there since it's been completed. I'm also very conscious of the fact that I've never been to any of the overseas landmarks, apart from the Moulin, which of course is no longer a landmark. So I've got treats like Villa Saraceno in store.
Thank you. We've got a question about Le Moulin, actually, saying what happened to it and how often and in what volume does Landmark lose buildings?
Well, it's pretty rare to lose a landmark, and we certainly view any relationship with a building as a long-term one and its owners if we don't actually own the building. I'm pretty sure that the Moulin was an example of a building where we were actually letting it on behalf of the owner, i.e. under this arrangement we call a management agreement. And it was, you know, a lovely building with its two sort of satellite landmarks that went with it. I think the problem was that it was reaching a stage where it really needed very sort of significant investment. And being a management agreement, it was for the owner to invest the money in it, not for us as effectively letting agents on this occasion. And I think the owner decided that really the level of investment that it was needed was more than he had the motivation and maybe the pocket to undertake. So in the end, he decided to withdraw the Moulin as a landmark and sell it on the open market, which it now duly has done for, I think, several millions. But it's pretty rare to lose a landmark. I mean, we have on occasions taken the decision to sell a landmark, but it's pretty rare.
Okay. You do have properties in Norfolk, but one of the county's most iconic landscapes is the Broads, where there are a number of isolated windmills and wind pumps that exist in various states of disrepair. There must be an ideal landmark around there somewhere.
Well, I think whoever has asked that is absolutely right. And there is one whose name temporarily escapes me, but is exactly that. It is a windmill with an adjoining cottage, very much on the Broads, you know, there as the windmills were to pump water and stop the surrounding land flooding. It's owned by one of the local wildlife trusts, and it is a building that, like a number we've looked at this evening, has been suggested on more than one occasion. But I simply can't get the owners, the wildlife trust, to engage. They seem very reluctant to respond, and at the moment it remains sitting there empty, and they seem happy with that. But maybe there are others out there, so watch this space.
Is there any particular reason why there are so many landmarks in the south and not so many further north? Is it a lack of suitable buildings, perhaps, or some other reason?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think it probably was a consideration that you know, travel time from Shottesbrooke probably inevitably plays some part in how easily one can get to a landmark, visit it, see it, assess it. We did, of course, have a rather bigger craftsman team than we do nowadays, and they were all based down in the southwest, which is possibly one of the reasons why there's quite a high concentration of landmarks down in the southwest. But it's by no means any lack of enthusiasm to tackle buildings further north. And as I indicated, it is a sort of priority for us to put more proactive endeavours into seeking landmarks north of Watford Gap.
Thank you. I think we've got time for two more questions. So there's a couple of questions here about overseas landmarks. Are there likely to be any additions in the future, which I think you touched on in your talk, but
yes.
Other questions about why we don't have any in Northern Ireland?
Well, yes, there's a good reason why we don't have any in Northern Ireland. We did, I think, you know, long before even my time with Landmark, when Sir John first set up the Landmark Trust, I think there was an intention that we might well have buildings in Northern Ireland. And I think at one time we did actually own a mill in Northern Ireland, but I think for various reasons, and because it sort of predates my time, I really don't know the details. I think in the end, Sir John decided not to pursue landmarks in Northern Ireland. And in fact, there is an organisation called the Irish Landmark Trust, which was sort of named with, I believe, with Sir John's sort of blessing, but is absolutely nothing to do with us, the Landmark Trust, at all. But they take on very similar buildings, sort of lighthouses, state cottages, lodges, that sort of thing, and they probably furnish them more similarly than any other holiday let organisation. And I think they probably have somewhere in the region of 20 or so buildings nowadays. And I think south of the border as well, in the Republic of Ireland. So that's really why we've left the field clear for the Irish Landmark Trust to tackle that particular area. I'd certainly say we wouldn't say never to another overseas landmark. And of course, some of the Italian ones are relatively recent in our relationship we have with FI, which is this sort of equivalent of a national trust in Italy. So yeah, never say never. There may well be something that comes along that we simply can't say no to, but at the moment we're very much concentrating our effort and energies into UK buildings.
Okay, and then one last question. Is Mavis Bank now a lost cause, or is there any realistic hope?
That's a very good question. I mean, I've known about Mavis Bank really for as long as I can remember. Save produced a report on the sort of future of, I don't know whether it's country houses in general or Scottish ones, but it had Mavis Bank, I think, on the front cover when the forecourt between it has these lovely curved wings with pavilions on the end, and the forecourt between those pavilions was riddled in sort of burnt out derelict cars. And Mavis Bank has proved to be an incredibly tough nut to crack, not least because the owner for many years, who was hell-bent on demolishing it, and did his best to try and get it demolished, but was luckily refused at every turn. I think in the end, in a sort of fit of spite, he left it to a non-existent company. And I believe one of the problems in trying to solve Mavis Bank is that if anyone wants to compulsorily purchase the building, which I think is the sort of the only solution to getting one's hands on it, it's a tricky legal one, because there is nobody to serve compulsory purchase papers on. And of course, it needs a really eye-watering sum of money spending on it. It makes the likes of Flewin-Kellin and Carvely Old Hall look relatively small beer. And so I think it's very much a case of watch this space. I don't think we or Historic Environment Scotland or many others have given up on Mavis Bank, and it would really be the most sort of triumphant success if Mavis Bank, which is the prettiest house ever over the early 18th century, really important in the Scottish Renaissance, could live again, and ideally, of course, as a landmark. So say your prayers and cross your fingers, and it may yet come good.
Thank you. So I'd just like to finish by saying thank you again to Alastair for a completely fascinating talk, and thank you to everyone for joining us. We're delighted that so many people have been listening, and I'll be sending out a recording to you all in the next couple of weeks. I hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.